Welcome back. We're talking about the challenges facing the European Union. Joining us from Rome is John Hooper, a former Southern Europe editor for The Guardian and Observer newspapers. He's currently a correspondent for the Economist news magazine. And Philippe Lamberts is one of Belgium's representatives to the European Parliament. He joins us from Brussels. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Philippe, let me start with you. There's a debate going on right now about the future of the European Union. We hear about Britain wanting to withdraw from the Union. There's pressure on the common currency, the euro. There's a new Europe versus an old Europe. Do you believe that the European Union is still a union, or do we see states, individual states, or groups of states increasingly acting in their own interest?
Well, indeed, we see a rising sentiment from various quarters in Europe that individual states are stronger on their own. I strongly doubt, of course, this approach. Let's look at the world map. Europeans represent 7% of the global population altogether. Sitting on 2.2% of the land of this planet, it's quite obvious that the only way for Europeans to weigh not just on their own affairs, but in the world affairs, is to act together. But that sentiment is receding, certainly in some quarters of our public opinion, but by and large in a significant part of the political leadership in Europe. And witnessed the recent refugee crisis, where the initiative of Chancellor Merkel to open the doors to war refugees from Syria and elsewhere has not been met with corresponding moves by other member states, including France, for instance. So whereas together we have capabilities, when we are acting individually, we are considerably weaker. And that leads Europe basically then to have to make deals with the likes of Erdogan of Turkey, so as to remedy the fact that we are unable to act together. So yes, the Union is at risk at the moment, and we should not underestimate that.
John, where do you see Europe heading? You know, when we look at some of the issues that Philippe just talked about there, the fact that there's very little cooperation among intelligence agencies in Europe in combating terrorism, and if we look at some of the issues that has put enormous strains on the alliance, the Greek debt crisis for one, the migrant crisis for another, where do you see Europe going?
Well, I see a split two ways, really. I mean, one is between creditor and debtor countries, where the line runs pretty much east to west, separating north from south. And then another line at right angles, which has been brought to light by the migrant crisis, splitting Western Europe, where there are generally, though certainly not universally, tolerant attitudes, from those that prevail in the east of Europe, where there has been really stiff resistance to any kind of sharing of the burden put on the European Union by the refugee crisis originating in Syria. So a pretty chronic situation in which there is more than one fracture inside this union, and there may yet be a third, of course, because of my own country holding a referendum on whether to stay in the European Union, something which, if it goes the way of leaving, could spark off similar thoughts and referenda in other parts of Europe.
And Philippe, sometimes these pressures on the European Union have unintended consequences. I mean, we're seeing, for instance, the migrant refugee crisis in Europe has led to the rise of extremist groups across Europe. This policy, I mean, the fact that refugees are coming to Europe appears to be fueling extremist politics. In many instances, we see hard right parties gaining more support in many countries. How big a problem is that for the alliance?
Well, it's a rising problem. I would say it was already there before the refugee crisis, but of course the refugee crisis fueled it and gave it ammunition going forward. Yes, it is a threat, but it has become bigger, not just because of the refugee crisis. Basically, the impression that our citizens are increasingly having is that, well, if you elect a mainstream right government or a mainstream left government, basically you get the same policies, which are the traditional pro-market neoliberal policies. Hence, a number of people who feel left behind, and don't forget that 25% of Europeans are at risk of poverty and social exclusion, well, those left behinds may then turn to alternative parties, which can be in a limited way at the extreme left and in a more numerical strong way at the extreme right. So if we could deprive those extreme right parties from the segment of their electorate that comes to them not because they are racist but because they are destitute, then we could really actively fight those parties. But there seems to be an ignorance in the mainstream parties of that factor, you know, and that's certainly the case in France. A significant part of the extreme right electorate is actually coming from the left, from people from popular quarters who feel cheated by the traditional left parties. And if they had done their job, then maybe Marine Le Pen would not have such a success today.
And John, are we also seeing that external pressures on the European Union are compromising or diluting some very cherished European ideals, things like a common currency? I mean, during the Greek debt crisis, there was talk at one stage of Greece going its own way, of adopting the drachma as its currency, its old currency again. There is also the common border, and we are seeing some countries now, in the face of the terrorist threat, reimpose internal border controls. The borders are going back up. So these cherished ideals that I'm talking about, are they being compromised here? Are they being diluted?
Yes, they are, unquestionably. This is as much a crisis of values as anything else in Europe. When you see the European Union, for example, cutting a deal with a country like Turkey, which of late has seen quite blatant abuses of the right to a free press, in order to solve its problem with refugees, then clearly you are in a crisis of values. And that, I think, began, you mentioned earlier on, the Greek crisis and the possibility of letting Greece go. I think it brought to light the speed with which the European Union has expanded over recent years. And I think it's brought into question whether, in fact, that expansion was too rapid. Both the inclusion of Greece in the single currency and also the inclusion of countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, that clearly have big questions about the values that have been regarded up until now as European, but really are turning out in many cases to be largely Western European values.
Philippe, what is your view in that? Did the European Union expand too quickly, and as a result, are we seeing two Europes right now, or as the former Irish Prime Minister told us a moment ago, more than two Europes, many Europes acting in their own interest? And for instance, you know, on the immigrant crisis, we get the new European countries like Hungary and Poland acting in one way, and old Europe, represented by countries like Germany and Italy and France, acting in another.
Well, you know, it would be interesting to have such groupings, but I do not see, for instance, these Western European countries like Italy, France and Germany acting in concert. If you look closely at their relationships, you see France letting down Germany on the refugee crisis. You see France letting down also Italy on the refugee crisis. You see Germany trying to impose its own style of economic policy on Italy. So actually, I do not see a coalition of, say, federalist member states who would want to move forward compared to other member states that would be, say, more nationalist. What I see is basically a group of 28 countries, each trying to fend for itself. And that to me is a crisis not just of values, which is, and I totally agree with what you just said, but also a crisis of lack of vision. That as if any member state, including the largest ones, could be able to have more sovereignty on their own rather than to have it shared with others in order to weigh more. Now, did we expand too fast? Actually, when you look at the delay it took from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the unification, it was 15 years, which is actually already quite a lot of time. Now, it's true that we assembled countries that had very different traditions and only very recent democracies in some cases, including Greece, by the way, which has been ruled by a dictatorship until 1974. So yes, we did expand probably too fast and before making the institutions able to work with 28 member states, which is more complex than when you have only a dozen. Nevertheless, I think that it was also a question of the ability of Europeans to face globalization.
And John, when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, we're talking about 28 countries here, 28 sovereign countries. Is it too much to ask them to have a common foreign policy? We saw that, for instance, during the Ukraine crisis, when Russia annexed Crimea and then expressed support for separatists in Ukraine. The European Union joined the United States in imposing sanctions on Russia, but those sanctions affected different countries differently. And I'm wondering, how much pressure does that put on solidarity in Europe?
A great deal. Unquestionably, foreign policy is one of those areas where Europeans have found it most difficult to align their interests, because the interests in many cases are, as you say, intrinsically different. Having said that, I think that what Mr. Lamberts said is in many ways correct, that what we've seen is a lag of the political side compared to the economic side. And this really goes back to the very origins of the European Union, the so-called money method. In other words, that you give people self-interest through economic unification, and gradually the political self-interest will come through, or the political unification will come through. And that's really been proved not to be the case. There is a broad area of economic self-interest which is well aligned. What we don't have is the alignment of political interest that's necessary, for example, to have a common foreign policy. And that really now, I think, is the challenge for Europe. And I think that in order to build it, then first of all, I think a lot of eggs are going to be smashed in making that omelette, if it ever does get made. And secondly, some countries, I think, will be lost along the way.
And that's where we have to leave it. John Hooper in Rome, Philippe Lamberts in Brussels. Thanks to both of you for joining us.